And his message was, and this is the context for our work there, was that we have some targets and we want to know how to get there. And the pro-poor element of this, those were his words, so he's obviously reading or listening. But they're very conscious of it. At least the willingness is certainly there. And he was very specifically looking for advice on changes in government policy that can create this space. And that isn't in isolation. You'll hear later about some work in Ethiopia, but the same is happening in Tanzania, the same in Zambia. It's been happening in South Africa for some time. They've already taken action on it. And I think that really is the issue on the table. First of all, how do we do the diagnostics that get tourism the attention of the Minister of Finance, so he recognizes that through his annual budget speech or his planning process, he or she can have an effect on this shared growth from tourism. And I think that's really kind of where we have to go, move from this diagnostics to the policy recommendations and the action on the ground, support it if necessary, get it moving. But I think we've also moved, and this certainly from the sort of perhaps the opportunity that I have to talk directly to governments. Really, it's pretty clear to me that we've moved a little bit away from needing to prove that tourism is an important part of an economy, and I'm meaning in Africa at the moment. What they're looking for is how to leverage that, and I believe that that desire is pretty genuine, and I think it places the onus back onto the development agencies who are providing advice and lending to support that and to sort of bring it to bear, as it were. And maybe agreeing with Simon that there does seem to be, or there are a number of changes around at the moment in the sort of broader political economy type of area that we have this opportunity. And from the World Bank's perspective, I think one perhaps weakness that we have is our implementation capacity. Once we sort of get the ball rolling, we often don't pay enough attention, I think, to results on the ground. And I think that's where a gathering like this, we have an opportunity to sort of appeal for partnership and to work together. An awful lot of NGOs and bilateral agencies that are working at the ground level that perhaps just lack maybe an authorizing environment, if you like, to kind of pursue the kind of work that you found to be quite important and yields results. So I really, so for me, policy implications, I think we have to separate a little bit as well and treat the donor development partner context equally with what's going on in governments and how we can address and make sure that the two are a little bit more harmonized.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to interpret the body language. Okay, thank you very much for a clear, simple, well-argued and beautifully presented presentation. And I have a whole series of questions, mainly, Caroline, how did you do that thing when they converge? We'll talk about that later. We're going to have to just talk to each other for a bit because we need a break before we have more presentations. Just put yourselves in the shoes of Mr. Sarkozy, Mr. Zolik, whoever the new head of USAID is, some people know. And just ask yourself this question. You just heard this presentation for an hour from these people. You're going to ask the three questions which will test this to destruction. I mean, there's a thesis here, there's an argument about policy. What's the most difficult question you can ask them that will, if they answer it, might convince you to make this part of your policy? So let's not go into fine detail. But think about how you're going to test this to destruction and see whether it's right. So you might go first. So as we've just started the discussion, please stand up, say who you are, and use a microphone.
I've got a microphone, thank you. I'm Pat Holden, and I'm from DFID, but I'm here at ODI for a month. Just come back from Barbados, where I've been based for 2 years. No jokes about somebody has to do it. So my first question is climate change. In a sense, taking up what Simon was saying earlier, nothing to do with aeroplanes, but the countries that seem to be most dependent on tourism are likely to be the ones, in poor countries anyway, are likely to be the ones most affected by climate change. So in the Caribbean, for example, people live in the dread of hurricanes for 6 months of the year. So how does all this link up to the climate change agenda? And secondly, the issue, tourism is notorious for revenue and income being generated going out of the country. And so, how does that factor into benefiting poor people? Where does that come in? And finally, it's also notorious for politics and corruption that surrounds the new developments and all the rest of it. So where do politics and governance issues come into all this? Thank you.
Very good. We'll take a few people. You don't have to ask a question, you can also say something.
Hi, I'm Kate Lloyd-Williams with the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector within the World Bank. The challenge for me is, particularly to my stakeholders and donor agencies, to say we don't yet have enough of a good case in tourism to say how do we know that tourism is contributing enough to poverty alleviation, because we are deciding where we put our money. So as donor agencies, we're deciding, do we invest in agribusiness or tourism, and where do we get the best return on investment? And my challenge I have is I can't yet make a good enough case to say, yes, in tourism we know this is how we lift this million people out of poverty, and that's really a challenge that we need to carry through this debate.
That's very helpful. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Dirk Villa round the corner.
Dirk de Velde from the ODI. These were very interesting presentations, and I was very much persuaded about the measuring issues, and that they have converged, and that in my eyes, they do really show that there is quite a high development impact, economic growth, and also poverty. But I have one question. Is basically, while we could be persuaded that these effects are so high, the policy actions on the ground don't match that. So we know that tourism is important for development, that other service sectors depend on tourism, tourism depends on other service sectors, and there are plans, tourism plans, and these are objectives. But the country's objectives, the prime ministers and presidents, may not have the same objectives as the tourism plans. And the question is, how can you get the importance of the fact that the tourism is so important in the budgets, as it were, but also at the radar screen of education ministries, because you need to persuade the country that having a career in tourism is something worth looking at, and that preference-dependent countries cannot be stuck forever in bananas, sugar, and so on.
That's why you've got the microphone. I mean, you're our services experts in ODI, among many other things you do. Just expand a bit on the point I made right at the beginning, which is that services is the big new thing.
Well, it's well known that as countries develop, the share of services in the economy is growing. And in well-developed countries it's 70%. In some African countries it can be only 30–40%. And that is increasing. Why is it the way forward? Well, particularly for, say, small states. Some of them have been dependent on preferences in the EU markets, US markets, and so on. And these preferences are growing. These countries are increasingly competing with bigger countries like China, Brazil, India, and so on. And they're competing on scale, so the small states will lose out. And so they have to move into something else. And thinking about certain services industries is a way forward. Now, tourism is obviously one very important one, and there are different aspects of tourism. Culture, cultural services, education services, everything that links into that. It's worthwhile for these economies. And I think it's not just small economies, it's also other economies where services are important. And in Kenya, it's a good example.
Okay, good, thank you. We'll take a couple more and then we'll just see where we go next. Lady in the front.
Yeah, I think that my question, Stroma Cole from Tourism Concern.
Can you stand up, do you mind? Because
No.
it's quite a big room.
I'm Stroma Cole, Chair of Tourism Concern and academic at BCUC. The climate change question would definitely be one of the questions that I would reiterate. I would also question the position of China, as in the tourists of China, on some of the worst examples of tourism I have seen in terms of being as unpro-core as possible, has been where it's been large groups of Chinese tourists. And
Two's good. Anybody else over there want to come in? Right at the back.
I think one major reason, or one major missing link that we still need, and you mentioned it also in your study, I've seen some of the drafts, is...
Just say who you are, sorry.
Sorry, my name is Klaus Lengerfeld, I'm from GTZ, German Development Corporation. We were the ones who did this famous sustainable all-inclusive study that is also cited in the work there, on the how much money leaves the all-inclusive resort and where does it go and how much benefits the poor. Still not published because we have not enough money from our donor to finish the study, and that's some missing links. But one important question: some of the parts of the research have already been published, and there are some figures already in the public. It was surprising us. But one major issue, and this is the question to you: in order to really have the idea of what is the proper impact and other sustainable impact of tourism, you have to compare it with other sectors of the economy. This has not yet been done. Also, this question of leakage. I can give you, Starbucks is considered a very good company in terms of responsibility, etc. When you drink one cup of coffee, £2 in the UK, €3 in Europe, and I take this figure from Wirtschaftswoche, one of the most serious economic newspapers, journals in Germany. It's from the £2, or from the €3, it's 1 cent that goes to the farmer. And you also cite this, so if we talk about leakage, you must have the complete figure of petrol, cocoa, oil, palm oil, all the agricultural stuff. And what we found is that they are by far, it's 10% of the money that I pay for it that stays in the country. And from tourism, it's about 20%. And if the airline is from the country, it's 40%. So, but this is a major challenge for the future. That's why a challenge is also development agencies and many other people will only believe us if we can come with these figures and say, this is what tourism would do, and this is what other sectors of the economy would do. And my question is, how could we proceed to have this overview that is important also as policy advice? If a country wants proper growth, is it through agriculture, is it through the other service industries, through tourism, or is it through mining or other sectors that they can have access to? Thank you.
Good. Listen, we're not going to have a full reply from the four of you on this because we must make sure we leave enough time for the other presentation. But what we're trying to do is test the narrative to destruction and see where we need to reinforce the armour plating. A very important point about comparative. It's not just tourism is good, it's tourism is better. And you've got to be able to deal with. I think the governance issue, is actually tourism more or less corrupt than, copper mining or oil? Is a similar kind of question. I think this issue about climate change, which has come up a couple of times, we need an answer on. And I thought it was a very interesting point about there are different kinds of tourists. Actually, when we were talking about the Yellow Brick Road, I was thinking about what the Spanish might have done to export by watching the bricks in Benidorm. And the answer is beer and egg and chips, I guess. But, would you rather have Chinese tourists or the Benidorm package tourists? Do you want to say one thing each before we move on to the final presentation, or would you prefer just to hold it until the later discussion?
One thing I would like to just address is the governance issue, because I think you have to put tourism in the context. It's relatively young as an industry, so younger than agriculture, for instance. The way that it has developed is pretty predatory. It's an easy cash earner. It brings foreign exchange. It generally, in developing countries, has been, say, the larger chunk of earnings from tourism have gone into the hands of the political economic elite. We might include the government in that as well. And this is, I think, as has happened in other industries. I mean, tourism, in a sense, it's kind of could be looked at a little bit like an extractive industry in that respect. And the kind of regulatory framework that you need to put around it and the safeguards that you need to build into it in order to ensure that some of those benefits from that economy do filter into the sort of lower stratas of the economy. I think it's important, but it's not a reason for not doing it. It's a reason for taking action, the way I see it.
Can I just say something on the climate change? Because I think that, I mean, what I'm going to say won't be the last word, I'm sure. But let's have the discussion. And we take it very seriously in ODI. We've got a full-time person now just working on that. And I asked him, how do we address this issue? What are the issues under climate change, and particularly long-haul discretionary tourism? And what he said was a couple of points I found very interesting. One is that it's an easy target, which is why we hear a lot about it. But actually, it's quite a small bit. So one argument is that of the UK's total emissions, air travel is 5%. Of that, 3/4 is domestic travel. Of the 1.5% of emissions resulting from international air travel, but that 2/3 of that goes to rich countries, and so we're talking about sort of fractions of 1%. So one argument we could have is that it's an important global issue for this specific area that we're looking at. It's quite small. That's one thing we could say. The counter to that, of course, is that it's growing fast. So I think I buy Sean's line that, given that it's small but growing fast, the issue I think should not be do stop tourism. I mean, partly because it's impractical, but also it's a bit like saying, 45% of the emissions in the UK come from houses. So it's a bit like saying we should not live in houses. I mean, what you do, what the debate in the housing sector is how you make it more efficient and you reduce that number. And I think some really interesting stuff going on in terms of the conservation, trying to reduce, given that people will travel, trying to reduce their carbon footprint there. But I think the third sort of line that you could take is to say, what we're talking about really is looking at tourism and trying to make it more pro-poor. So actually what we're talking about is not necessarily increasing tourism, it's trying to change the distributional impact of tourism, which in itself would be carbon neutral, or if you look at what people were doing before they were drawn into the tourist sector, it might be very crudely extractive and cutting trees down, and so you could actually, within the tourism sector itself, get a carbon gain from people working, for instance, within well-organised hotels rather than extractive and high carbon activities. So I think it's a real debate. I mean, it's going on in my own mind as well, but I don't think we should be shy about confronting.
No, very good. I believe that 2/3 of British air travel is domestic.
Yeah, that's the carbon generated. No, it's taking off. It's taking off. It doesn't.
Can I say something on leakages? Yeah, we can do it in one sentence or two because we're going to
very
go through time.
But yeah, just a question about leakages. I mean, interestingly, you did say you spent 2 years in Barbados, and in fact, tourism is actually the major industry, as you know.
And everywhere else
in Barbados, but maybe particularly the longest tourism industry in the Caribbean is Barbados. And it's actually taken Barbados out of a low-income country designation. So whatever the leakage is, say in Barbados, a lot of money has stayed. And I think that that's the other side of the leakage debate. It's not the proportion of leakage, it's the absolute number of dollars or pounds and so on that have stayed in the country. And I think Barbados is a particularly good example of a country which has benefited from tourism and is actually a very pleasant place to live, as I'm sure you will agree. Much more so than many other parts of the Eastern Caribbean. The other issue you read was governance, and I think corruption is a problem. And I don't think you can blame tourism for bad governance, but I do get back to the point that has already been made that you've got to go on and do tourism. You try to build in controls, and I've been working in Cambodia off and on for a couple of years, and corruption is rampant in Cambodia. It doesn't mean to say that you're not supposed to give aid there, but you try to control the aid and tie it as much as possible to certain conditions, and try to keep a tab on what's happening. It may not always be very easy, but it's why one has to look at problems.
There's obviously lots to discuss, but we need to get the other presentation out in order to open up another agenda for us. Caroline and John and Jonathan again. So Sean, would you like to retreat back to the
Okay, I'll move straight on. We've been looking at the big picture, the pathways, the conceptual framework. We're going to look at some evidence, some data, some meat. Let's try and get some facts on the table. We want to help poor earn more from tourism. We're going to focus in this session specifically on money revenue. I acknowledge that is not all that matters in the poverty impact. Of course, there are non-financial issues. So up front, what we're looking at here is money that poor people earn. And if we want to increase the money that poor people earn, well, we need to know what they're earning from the tourism value chain. And as John mentioned, quite surprisingly, there's not that much evidence, not that much data on this. So we're going to look at some recent work that has been done to actually see where people are earning in the tourism economy. If we used to ask this question, well, we knew they were working as unskilled workers, and we knew they were working as food vendors, or chai stall operators, or rickshaw drivers. We knew the poor were earning money from community tourism, partnerships, and so on. We had a rough idea of the ways in which they engaged. But that's kind of all we had, a rough idea of pockets of participation by the poor. But by last year, it really was time to say, well, we don't know enough, so let's map the tourism economy and find out. Well, what is the income reaching for participants? So I'm going to run you very quickly through what mapping can do, and then I'm going to hand over to John, who's going to talk through the results. So this is not trying to present results, this is just showing the idea of mapping the subchain, the accommodation sector, the food sector, so isn't very much in focus, the excursions, the temples and the like, and the crafts, shopping, handicrafts sector. This is an example from Luang Prabang where you can look at how much money is being spent in each subchain by the tourists in the destination. Under that you can look at who's involved, who are the owners, who are the workers, and who are the suppliers. Obviously important to look at the supply chain. Now within here you can start saying, okay, where are the poor? Which households are poor or maybe just above poor, now sufficient, largely due to their tourism income? You can look at where women are involved. In these blue boxes, women are a significant proportion. In the green boxes, women are actually the majority. You can look at where ethnic minority people are involved, particularly over here in craft. You can start mapping the different places in the chain where different types of poor people are involved. You can do it for rural, you can do it for very poor, separate skilled, semi-skilled and unskilled. You can do different things with a map. Best of all, if you do a lot of number crunching and a few midnight oils, you can work out how many dollars are actually flowing down each subchain to different poor groups. John will come back to these findings, so I won't go into them now. So that's what we've been trying to do, map out the tourism economy. We're also using value chain approaches, this phrase you'll be hearing today, so I thought we'd better say what we mean. We take this quote, value chain describes the full range of activities which are required to bring a product or service from conception through production, delivery, final disposal after use. Value chains are normally designed for production of goods. Tourism, of course, is a service, So production and consumption of the service tend to happen at the same time while the tourist is in the destination. The value chain analysis focuses on all the different links in the chain and the interlinkages between them, returns to different stakeholders and governance issues. We can debate what exactly of the analysis we're covering counts as value chain analysis, what is mapping. We're not really interested in that debate. It's one of the tools we have been applying. So what we're going to hear in this session are two of the first applications of local economic mapping or value chain analysis done last year in Luang Prabang and the Gambia. Later this afternoon, some other results from some other destinations will be involved. The two common questions for the differences between the studies. The two key questions. Where do the poor participate, and where could participation be increased? Just to summarise, the Gambia is a winter sun beach holiday destination, 110,000 visitors a year, mainly on packages. Luang Prabang in Laos, completely different. Cultural heritage town, a UNESCO site, temples, ethnic minority villages, similar number of tourists, but the majority are independent. Slightly more than half are fairly cheap backpackers, and slightly less than half of the more upmarket tourists. Now I'm going to hand over to John Hummel from SNV to describe the Luang Prabang study, and then to John to do the Gambia one.
Thank you very much. As said before, my name is John Hummel. I work for SNV, the Netherlands Development Organization. And the Netherlands Development Organization is an organization that works in about 33 countries with about 700 advisors, 1,800 local clients. And part of that is under tourism. In tourism, we work with about 50 tourism advisors, about 20 of those working in Asia. In Asia, what do we try to do in pro-poor sustainable tourism? We strengthen linkages between the tourism industry, local livelihoods, and the wider economy. It's very much trying to get different stakeholders involved. We do that through participatory tourism planning and stakeholder, multi-stakeholder collaboration. We do a lot of training and a little bit of research with knowledge providers, and we support strategies, policies, and legal frameworks in sustainable tourism and poverty reduction for that basin. Why we needed to assess the Luang Prabang tourism economy? We had an evaluation at the end of 2005, and we noticed that SNV is working very much on local communities, ecotourism, and very, very small-scale activities. And the question that we got from SNV itself is like, how does it impact? How do we get leverage? How do we get more people benefiting from it? So it was time to review the SNV activity and to see how can we help the poor better. What are the best mechanisms to get that impact for the poor? And so we invited ODI in May 2006 to do a tourism value chain analysis, especially in Luang Prabang. The key questions for that was really like how poor people are currently participating in tourism in Luang Prabang, and how can we get more earnings for them out of tourism in the area. When the study was done, poor was defined as unskilled and semi-skilled people. This is a very broad definition of poor people. And probably because of that, also, there's more benefits to a wider group of people. So the part of the pie that goes to semi-skilled and unskilled labourers is relatively large compared to other examples where you have a more narrow definition of poor. In the case of Luang Prabang, 4 major sub-chains were analysed. There was accommodation, food and beverages, excursions and handicrafts. And these are the 4 sub-sectors that come back in quite a lot of the studies. Here are the results. What you see is that a lot of money is made in accommodation and in food and drinks. Curious as well, but far less in excursions. But a very important result out of this study was that only 6% in the accommodations was going to semi-skilled and unskilled labourers and people. But in the supply chain of food and drinks, it was almost up to half. Same for the crafts, because textiles is very well developed in Luang Prabang, and excursions as well. 1/3 of unskilled and semi-skilled people were benefiting. So what you see is, how does it impact on the poor, and what kind of benefits does it give? For instance, in accommodations, it seems to be very little. There's some poor relatives employed, but it's mainly families, more educated people that benefit from tourism. But in, for instance, the food and drinks, there's a direct link to the farmer society, there are backward linkages, and there is where a lot of the income is being made.
John, can you just to clarify, this is money spent in the destination?
Money spent in the destination.
So it
Yeah.
excludes all the transport?
It excludes all the transport. This is just the money made in Luang Prabang, which adds up to 23 million a year for one town that's quite significant. And I mean, one of the conclusions that we will come back to later is that SMB might take Luang Prabang, in the case of Luang Prabang, tourism as a starting point for the whole economy, and see how others might relate, other sectors relate to tourism.
Right, so just in terms of the cup of coffee example,
Yeah.
I mean, this is the 1 cent, so to speak. I mean, do we know what the total value of the cup of coffee is? 200-300 million?
Do we? Yeah. Do we?
Yes.
How many people are we talking about this is being distributed amongst? And how is it that farmers are sometimes unskilled? I'm confused. Sorry.
Okay.
Silk weavers, unskilled.
Yeah.
I didn't want to open a whole flood.
Yeah.
You better answer that one. Good question.
It's a good question. It is the people living in the area that do not have a formal education. So farmers came to the group of unskilled and semi-skilled straight away, because there's a lot of farmers that do not have a formal education in this area. How many people are we talking about? It is the whole district, and that adds up to it's 400,000, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
we don't know how many people. In some of these categories, we know how many actual poor people are, like workers in the hotels. And in the other categories, like the farmers that produce the rice that gets sold, we don't know how many poor individuals are involved.
Yeah.
Carry on, John. I'm sorry about the interruption.
In Curios, we had the weavers benefiting, the silk suppliers benefiting, the vendors benefiting, and in the excursions it was mainly the guides, political drivers, and the villagers for parts of it. Yeah. This gave the main overview of the results of who is earning what. And we have to come back to the question of how many people are those in total. What we saw is that in some of the change you can make a difference for the poor. In others, the opportunities might be less. Like in the accommodation, there is less of an opportunity in Luang Prabang to intervene. Of course, you have to give training and support, but direct benefits are less. In others, you had better opportunities, and we will come back to that later. What we saw, based on the study of Caroline, of ODI, Caroline Ashley, was that 27% of the total tourist expenditure in the area went to these unskilled and semi-skilled labourers, out of the overall people working in the industry or related to it. Up to half of the earnings of the poor went to the food and beverages supply chain for these two groups. And there is a lot of importance in the craft income for poorer people, because as you saw in the earlier slide of Caroline, a lot of minorities are involved in that. So for them, there's a link to getting benefits out of tourism. Aside from the supply chains, most benefits are concentrated around the town. And this is certainly a concern because at this moment it is all centre-based. Going to priority recommendations, you have an increased, what we can change is increasing the supply of fresh fruit and vegetables from Lao farmers to restaurants, hotels, street side shops. Increase the supply of Lao silk and cotton for handicraft production, actually replacing the imports of substitutions, and restructuring the product offer in the rural villages and increasing the tourist time and expenditure in rural areas. One of the things that you quite often see, and that's also coming back to what John was saying before,